Hello and welcome to the 82nd Synergia Forum, the 18th in our series of virtual forums. And the topic for discussion today is the road ahead for US foreign policy in Asia. And we have two colossal experts on the subject to give us their introductory opinion and remarks on this matter. And then we will have special guests, a stellar set of them, to make observations and questions. We have the fascinating David Ignatius, Associate Editor of the Washington Post, journalist, author, and an intellectual whose writings, may I say, real and real, go well beyond a body of lies. Thank you so much, Mr. Ignatius, for joining us.
Thanks to be here.
We also have from New Delhi, Mr. Shiv Shankar Menon, one of India's finest strategic thinkers and a huge influence on India's foreign policy over the last couple of decades. A man who's seen India and the world both from the perspective of a former national security advisor and that of a former foreign secretary in India. Thank you so much, Mr. Menon, for joining us.
Thank you for asking me.
We're glad you agreed to our request. And we have our special guests for the evening. We have a stellar set of them. Bill Edmond, former editor-in-chief of The Economist, a distinguished journalist and someone who has very astute observations of himself about the foreign policy and issues relating to foreign policy in the region. Thank you so much, Mr. Emmett, for joining us.
Delighted to be here.
And we have Ariel Levitt, a non-resident senior fellow in nuclear policy program at the Carnegie Endowment, a former deputy national security advisor for defense policy in Israel. Thank you so much, Mr. Levitt, for joining us.
Thrilled to be in such a distinguished company.
Well, the format for this evening, to all those viewers who are tuning in to our website to watch this stellar set of speakers at this virtual forum, the format is simple as usual. We will have Mr. Ignatius and Mr. Menon make their opening remarks on the subject, and then we will have observations from Mr. Bill Emmott and Mr. Levitt to carry the conversation forwards as a discussion. We will also be joined by a distinguished set of special other guests who will pose questions to the panelists at a later stage. So without wasting any further time, Mr. Ignatius, could you outline for us what you believe are the key challenges and issues ahead in terms of foreign policy for the United States in Asia?
With pleasure. It's really wonderful to be here virtually with all of you. We feel cooped up wherever we are as we try to get through this pandemic, and webinars like this that connect us with a wider audience are wonderful. So thank you for watching. I want to begin by just noting that this morning here in Washington, every newspaper is dominated by the discussion of the choice of an Indian American woman, Kamala Harris, as the vice presidential candidate for Joe Biden. And I think this the theme of her life, her background, her connections both to the African American community and to the Indian American community are going to be one of the drivers of this campaign. We're coming from a Trump administration that's very much looking inward, America first, in some instances outspokenly anti-immigrant administration. Now we'll have a ticket running against Trump that will have in the vice presidential slot somebody who directly embodies the strengths and dynamism that our diverse culture gives us. So that's going to be an interesting starting point for the campaign, which begins tonight, your time, this morning, mine. So I think the biggest foreign policy issue, without question, that will be debated through this campaign, and as the next administration, be that the second Trump administration or a new Biden administration takes office, will be U.S. policy in Asia, most specifically U.S. policy toward China. This is a subject that the American foreign policy elite, of which my friend Shankar Menon is a regular guest, so he knows all of the discussions that have been taking place within these groups. For the last several years, has been thinking about China. America had an assumption that in China, free markets of the sort that the United States was pushing so enthusiastically through all of the decades of Chinese modernization, starting with Deng Xiaoping, continuing, that free markets would bring free Chinese men and women. that there would be political consequences of this extraordinary growth that we've seen. And that was the optimism, I think, of a generation of American foreign policy leaders as they thought about China. That assumption now is undergoing a very, very significant revision. As people look at Xi Jinping, they look at his success in making the Communist Party an instrument of authoritarian control. Xi, in my judgment, has purged a level of leadership in the party, in the Chinese military, and also in Chinese intelligence. So across the board in security and political control, this is now Xi's generation, and they're doing a decisive job of controlling, and when you look at Hong Kong, look at China itself, you'd say suppressing any dissent or criticism to their rule. So the framing of this new China consensus, replacing the old one, is still ongoing, but I think that you can see some clear agreement between the Trump administration, the policies it's following, and what a Democratic administration would do. It's going to be a somewhat tougher line on trade, on rebalancing the terms of trade. I think it's going to be a somewhat tougher line on the sharing of technology. There's fairly widespread support for the idea that there should be limits on the technology that's passed to a company like Huawei, China's telecommunications 5G champion. So as a Chinese friend said to me a year ago, we're looking at a world of at least some partial decoupling of technology, and I think that's going to be true no matter who wins. If Vice President Biden ends up as president, I think we'll see a return to some traditional themes of American policy in Asia, but with some modernization, if you will. I think it's possible that we'll return to discussion of some sort of multilateral trade agreement like the Trans-Pacific Partnership. To my judgment, as an analyst, the inability to politically carry through on the TPP was one of American foreign policy in the last few decades. It was an agreement that benefited all those who took part. It created momentum that I think would have been irresistible for the Chinese. Perhaps there'll be a way to find some new version of that going forward. Second, I think there's a fundamental rethink taking place about American defense policy in Asia, led by people who argue that our suite of weapons, our magnificent aircraft carriers, F-35 fighter jets, all the other remarkable weapons that the United States has in the field, really are not suited to the kinds of challenges we're going to have with China. These are our weapons systems built for the projection of power, built for the world that the United States had grown accustomed to dominating several generations ago. They're not so useful in dealing with problems that might arise in some kind of conflict with China. As a friend of mine, Chris Brose, who I know Shankar and probably Bill Emmett know well, who has studied the need to modernize our defenses. As he puts it, our aircraft carriers in the first hours of any conflict with China will be steaming east away from China, not towards China, because they need to get out of the range of Chinese missiles. Similarly, our F-35 exquisite fighter jets will have difficulty refueling to be able to reach any targets of significance because they depend on aerial refueling, and those refueling tankers are completely vulnerable. So there's discussion about a whole range of new weapons. The final point that I'd make as I think about Asia in the United States in the future is that we will turn with new attention and seriousness to our allies in Asia. And I want to include India on the list of, if not outright partners in defense, certainly allied countries in thinking about a stable region. So we'll turn to India for conversations about the shape of Asia and Asian defense. We'll turn to Japan, traditionally a strong ally of the United States, a country that's managed to have good relations with administrations, Democratic and Republican, in recent years. I hope we'll look to South Korea as a good partner. Certainly we'll look to Australia. So America's great advantage traditionally in foreign policy has been it's a country that has good allies. China's list of allies is slim indeed. The same with Russia. The United States, if it's sensible, if it doesn't go about alienating these allies that it's lucky to have, I think begins with an enormous advantage, whoever is president. So the maintenance of allies is crucial. I want to make a final comment, and that is that last week, as Shankar and Bill know, and Eli in Israel, the United States lost somebody who really symbolized the very best of our foreign policy tradition in Brent Scowcroft. Brent Scowcroft was a friend of mine with whom I wrote a book, co-wrote with him and Zbigniew Brzezinski in 2008 called America and the World. And it was striking to me when Brent passed away last week, how relevant the arguments that he and Zbig made in 2008 were today. It's pretty much the same list that a sensible person would make. First, think about your allies. Take good care of those alliances. Second, be careful about military entanglements, especially in the Middle East. Brent was not a man who was an adventurer in terms of projection of military power. Almost alone among Republicans, he told George W. Bush, do not invade Iraq. Do not start that. He couldn't have been more right. He also was somebody who understood that once we get involved in a country, we need to be careful about getting out too quickly. So he was not enthusiastic about leaving Iraq quickly, as many advocated. And finally, he embodied the thing that I think in the end is America's most valuable asset in dealing with the world. It's not American power, which remains overwhelming, so much as American humility in a world of Xi Jinping's and Vladimir Putin's. Having a leadership that shares that quality of Brent's. So we think of the kind of American reticence, caution, maturity. So those are qualities that I think of with his passing. And I'd conclude my opening comments by saying that I think in terms of U.S. policy in Asia, there's more consensus between Republicans and Democrats than you might think. And one place it begins is a common recognition that India has become a crucial partner for us economically, intellectually, culturally. The power that's in this U.S.-Indian relationship, I think, is one of the most significant new facts about the way the world works. So with that, I'll turn it over to my friend Shankar Menon and the other commentators, but thanks very much for inviting me.
Well, thank you. Actually, I agree with everything that David said. He's actually summed up the situation where we are and what we would hope for and maybe expect also from U.S. foreign policy after in 2021 onwards. Now, my own sense, frankly, exactly as David said, is that we've gone through in the last few years two fundamental sort of shifts. One is China's behavior has become increasingly assertive, and certainly since the pandemic, what we're seeing is wolf warrior diplomacy, as the Chinese themselves call it. And this has had an interesting effect. In India, for instance, today, approval ratings and expectations of the US are higher than I can ever remember them. Some of it is a reaction to what's happened between us and China, especially since the spring onwards in Ladakh. But it's more than that. If you look at the approval ratings Pew this year, when they checked, I think India is one of the countries with the highest approval ratings for US foreign policy around the world. And it's not just India. What China's behavior has done is it's revitalized the Quad. It's actually got those of us on China's periphery, the maritime periphery, all the way from Japan through Australia, Indonesia, Vietnam, Singapore, India, all of us working together in ways that 10 years ago would have seemed impossible. So if the US comes back looking for allies and partners to work with, to deal with the shift in the balance of power that China is trying to undertake in this region, she will find willing partners. And that, I think, is actually an improvement on the situation that obtained earlier. So for me, therefore, the time is ripe for a much more active US involvement in the Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific, whatever you want to call it. But what should it be? One, I think, as David said rightly, is the economic aspect, because what's happening now is that the world economy is really fragmenting. You have the US, Mexico, Canada free trade arrangement. You have the EU going its own way, and now the RCEP, which since India's also walked out, increasingly China's looks like China's sort of economic sphere. So it would make sense if the US were to re-engage economically with either TPP or a successor or with some other version which brings the Indo-Pacific together. But the second aspect is the bit that none of us can do alone, not the US, not China, not India, not Japan, nobody, which is the whole slew of transnational issues that we face here. Whether it's maritime security, pandemics, I mean, it's clear we have a problem here. Cybersecurity, climate change, the list, counterterrorism, the list just goes on. And nothing has been done about it. The strange thing is we have an institution in the East Asia Summit where everybody is represented and where the US is a natural leader. So here again, it seems to me that one of the easier ways in, perhaps, rather than the US having to assume fresh responsibilities, would be to work with partners and to revive institutions which we already have and to get them going to deal with these new agenda issues. So the economic fragmentation, the new security agenda of transnational issues, and the big issue, will China moderate her behavior? I think if she sees what's happening around her, frankly, at some stage when the stresses caused not just by the pandemic, but by various changes within China, once those stresses, I think, are less imminent and somehow seen as less threatening, then maybe we have a chance, but I don't know. This is the big question. Can we shape China's behavior? But if we don't try, we won't. And the only way to do that, I think, is together. So, and there are enough of us today, there is a critical mass of countries today who are willing to do so. At least that's my sense. The pandemic has actually shaken us loose from a lot of old certainties. And that has actually helped. So we have a moment here, a sort of hinge moment where if we are sensible and use the crisis that we have to, as they say, advance forward, I think we can do something for Asia's not just security, but prosperity, and we can do it together. The risk is, of course, that otherwise we'll go the other way because we have new authoritarians in power across Asia, relying on ultranationalism for their legitimacy, and therefore unable to do the kind of give and take, the kind of reasonable bargaining which is necessary, the compromises that we have to do if we want to come up with good solutions. But let's hope that this crisis that we've gone through for the last 6 months has, since it's diminished everybody, both in reputation, in power, and in terms of prosperity, in terms of their economies, let's hope that it has driven some sense into all of us. We live in hope. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much, Mr. Menon. It was actually very interesting, the point that you're making, which has been argued upon, that there needs to be an effort to engage with China with a certain amount of caution to make sure that we can shape the policy. Several experts have pointed out, you yourself have said that India needs to have argued that India needs to have a continental strategy that works for it as a relationship with China, a relationship with China gets more and more adversarial. Now, the question is this, when we speak about that kind of an engagement, and this is a question that I'd like both you and Mr. Ignatius to answer, are we looking towards the possibility even of a trilateral perhaps between India, US and China? Because in a large prism it seems to be this or that, a choice between this or that. Maybe is that not the right prism to look at, and maybe looking at a larger engagement between the three countries from an India point of view would be the way to go forward?
David, you want to go?
Well, so let me lead off. I think ever closer, ever more supportive relations between India and the United States in the defense sphere and the foreign policy, national security area generally are a good thing. In terms of anything more formal, I think that's going to be shaped by Chinese decisions, and should be. I think we still want to be careful, even with China's extraordinary belligerence on the Indian frontier, its aggressive moves in the South China Sea. Even now, I think we still want to be careful about forming what will appear to be a military alliance against China. We may come to that, but I'd be very interested in Shankar's view. For now, I think staying somewhat short of that, having more informal relations, encouraging the kinds of contacts between India, Japan, and Australia with the United States as a kind of quiet fourth wheel in that process, that all makes sense. Taking it to something more formal that begins to look like a NATO in Asia, I don't think it's time for that.
I agree with David, actually. This is not time for a nation NATO. Partly because I think, if you look at the relationships that each of our countries has with China, it's very different from the bipolar Cold War. This is not actually a situation where we don't trade with each other, where we have such fundamental ideological differences. I think today's problem really is anarchy and opportunism, rather than a fixed bipolar system within which we are operating. So I don't think an alliance is really the answer to it right now. Your question about can there be an India, China, US trilateral? My answer to the kind of situation we're in has actually, I have this mantra about issue-based coalitions of the willing. Pick an issue, you'll get a different set of countries who are able and willing to actually participate in solving the issue. Not everybody is bothered by cybersecurity the same way, or maritime security. And you will find different countries, different sets of countries to work with. This is going to be hard diplomatic work, and it will not be easy, this sort of variable geometry. But I think it's worth doing, because the issues really have now got really serious. But not everybody is going to get involved in trying to solve the North Korean nuclear problem, for instance, or even the South China Sea issue, though freedom of navigation through the South China Sea would be everyone's interest. But not everybody has the capability to get involved in trying to work out rules of the road that work for everybody. That's something that I think, and so it seems to me, therefore, that we need to think of this a little more flexibly, as David said.
Right, interesting. We need to be flexible. But, sir, may I just prod you further and ask you, Mr. Menon, in terms of the foundation for a continental policy that India must look at, as you point out, what would be those foundations? I mean, is it possible for us to build regional alliances given the kind of influence that we see from China in this region?
Well, what you've seen so far is China pushing at an open door across Eurasia for the last few years with the Belt and Road, building physical connectivity. But China has not actually gone beyond that to the actual stage of exercising either political influence or of being a provider of security in these regions. And once she starts moving into the politics, into more than just building infrastructure, economic prosperity, and money all around, that's when I think you will see other countries responding, whether it's Iran, whether it's Russia, whether it's Turkey. And I think you're now approaching that stage. Now, what that means for our relationship with the US is that I think we would be asking the US to cut us some slack. I mean, the US today has trouble if we trade with Iran, what we do with Russia, for instance, which we still depend on for defense platforms, even though the US has now become one of our major sources of defense supplies. But I think, and this is why I said we need a more flexible way of dealing with it, because our primary congruence with the US, India-US, is really maritime, is in the Indo-Pacific. And I'm not sure that the US is ready to get involved, certainly not in a land war on the Asian continent anymore, after the experience of the last 25 years. But even, I'm not sure how far it would be fair to ask the US to get involved on the Eurasian landmass in political defense, other issues. So I do think that we need to work with the partners we can find, depending on the issue, as I said.
Right, interesting. Mr. Ignatius, your thoughts on how far is the US willing to go on these issues on the ground?
As I said earlier, I think this will be shaped by the decisions China makes. We have learned some cruel lessons in the last 15 years about the limits of U.S. military power to shape, determine outcomes. So I think there's going to be a wariness about deploying large units, traditional ways of projecting power. I think, as Shankar said, our shared interest in maritime security, the renewed emphasis on having a presence, asserting freedom of navigation, even in contested areas like the South China Sea. There'll be strong continuity in that. There's beginning to be some new ideas, driven in part by questions about what weapons we can afford and really need, about the suite of weapons that will most effectively deter China, be useful if conflict, God forbid, should ever arise. And those weapons probably look different from what we have now. They're smaller, in many cases unmanned platforms. They're cheaper. They're the ratio of cost to the platform you have and the cost of the weapon that shoots it down will change. So I think we're going to enter a very different period. There is an understanding among our senior military leadership that the images we have of conflict in Asia that are really drawn from World War II, of battleships steaming and opening contested straits and island landings by Marines leaping out of amphibious vehicles onto the shores of distant places. Those are powerful images of the projection of American military might, but they're not really relevant to the world that we're thinking about. And in truth, just to make one final comment, in the real world that we're going to be looking at and thinking about over the next few years, Taiwan will loom large. The security of Taiwan, the ability of the United States and its friends, but really the United States, to protect Taiwan's security. That used to be a point that our military planners had some confidence about. We could steam a couple of aircraft carriers and all the accompanying weapons into the Taiwan Strait, and that projection of power would probably be enough to deter any Chinese attack or make it far too costly for China to contemplate. I think people would make a different assessment today. So with Taiwan, as with Hong Kong, I've argued that we have a problem of moral hazard. We need to be careful about not encouraging people to do things that we, the United States, couldn't in the end support. I think that extends to military conflict across the Taiwan Strait. So it's a different world. I think the fact that the United States and India now talk with such clarity and shared interest about China. I can remember a time when that was awfully a tricky conversation, Shankar. We kind of skirt around it, but we don't now. We talk more directly and honestly and think about shared challenges. And but as I said at the outset, I think the degree of Chinese aggressiveness in asserting their power militarily in the region is going to be the driver for what the United States, India, Japan, all the other key nations decide about how to respond.
Right, interesting. Before I can get Mr. Bill Emmott and Ariel Levitt in, just referring to your opening remarks, Mr. Ignatius, you were talking about the importance of allies. Well, I guess the allies haven't been trumped like they have been in the recent past. And given that you say that there may be a broad amount of understanding and agreement between Democrats and Republicans in terms of foreign policy and the way they look at India, I just want to know quick comments from you on, you have also been someone who's predicted that, Trump a Trump administration would strategically compromise US interests around the world and would weaken its foreign policy position. How would you see the road ahead, even if there is a change in the next US elections? Do you believe that, how long would you believe it would take the US to regain its sense of soft power or influence in the region and a sense of trust from its regional allies?
I'm not sure we'll ever get back to the way the world was, and I don't want to say before Trump, but the world that we remember in the late 1990s, 2000. I think that world, that paradigm for American foreign policy is probably gone. A lot of the work for a new administration is just repair work. We have needlessly disrupted and offended our allies, countries that we depend on and should continue to depend on for shared security. Germany is the most obvious example, a kind of gratuitous effort to disrupt the relationship with Germany. The relationship with India has been fairly consistent, but even there, I think some repair work is needed. The relationship with Japan goes all over the place. It's generally positive under Trump. The big concern, and I'll close with this, nations that are friends, moving toward allies and partners of the United States, need to trust the United States as a guarantor of security in the extreme situation. NATO in the end is about trusting that the United States would be prepared to risk its own security to defend Europe's. And to a lesser extent, our partnerships in Asia are based on the same shared confidence that you'd be there for us. And I think that's what's been damaged in this period. Trump is so erratic, it's so hard to know from one week to the next just where he stands on an issue, that continuity, trust, that essential quality, I think, has been harmed. Repairing that is job one for the next president, or if Trump is reelected, it's job one for him. He better get more serious about it.
Well, yes. Let me just bring in Mr. Bill Emmott as well at this stage. How does the view look halfway between Washington, D.C. and New Delhi, Mr. Emmott?
Well, thank you for having me, and let me congratulate Shankar Menon and David Ignatius on two very excellent presentations. From my point of view, all I would add are the following points. One is that if we define the problem that we really need US policy to repair, part of the problem is in the US, which is not necessarily to do with Trump or no Trump, but it's about the lack of coherence and clarity of US policy in recent years, which I think dates back also to the Obama administration, where the pivot to Asia was never really carried through, partly because of lack of time. It came late. But basically, American policy has been incoherent. It's not been inactive. Indeed, many would say that American policy under Trump has been highly active, but it's been inactive. It's been poorly directed. It's been erratic, as David absolutely said. This has created the vacuum of anarchy and opportunism that Shankar Menon rightly described. And I think the first problem is ending that incoherence and trying to fill that vacuum. The second problem is China's assertiveness, which is, I think, an assertiveness not as a form of territorial expansionism, but rather a new spirit of no longer caring what other people think. No longer caring and no longer feeling that there's a price to be paid for certain sorts of behavior. And it's not necessarily a threat, but it is disruptive absolutely to the rules-based order. So what questions would I pose? Where would I lead things to say? I'd say 2 points. One question, I think a complication in US foreign policy, especially under Trump, has been the way it gets blended together with trade policy. Trade is the huge disruptor of coherent foreign policy, in my view. Delusions about trade deficits, delusions about balanced trade, but also it turned foreign policy into a transactional affair. So my question, probably to David, but also to Shankar as an observer, would be, under a new administration, if there was a Biden-Harris administration, could they downgrade trade as the driver of US foreign policy? Can we cease the relationship with countries to be one about balance and simply more about security interests? Second is, I think, a thing that I struggle with is a question of, well, what's the objective with China? What actually do we want the outcome of a foreign policy to be as far as Chinese behavior is concerned? It's not containment. It's not confrontation. It's, I think, trying to incentivize China to go back to a rules-based, institution-based order, which they were essentially devotees of in the 1990s when they felt weaker and have somewhat thrown away, as I think Shankar Menon said. Is there a bipartisan agreement about that as an outcome? But what you want is a strong China, if China is strong, but rather a China that participates in multilateral institutions. And I would agree very much with Shankar Menon that rebuilding the institutions that exist, including the East Asia Summit, would be the place you'd want to start. But you'd want to put in really strong incentives to try to give China the encouragement and indeed the sense of a necessity that they would support and indeed participate in this. Not easy.
Mr. Menon? And
you want me to respond now?
Please go ahead.
You know, on incentivizing, I entirely agree with you, Bill, that, you know, China's too big to be contained. She's too involved in the rest of the world economically. She's an economic superpower. The rest of the world needs China in the world economy. You don't want an angry, resentful, hurt, but powerful China. I mean, that's the worst outcome from our point of view. But that doesn't mean that we can therefore just give in to all this kind of wolf warrior diplomacy. And so, as you said, finding the incentives. I'm a little nervous that whether we'll be able to do this. And as you said, the trade is going to be the problem because everybody's economy has taken a hit. You might not admit it. Some parts of the world might think they're coming out of the pandemic first, but the economic hit that everyone has taken is considerable. This was a crash. It's not just a recession or a depression. I mean, it's a crash. And therefore, it seems to me that the first instinct, you've heard Xi Jinping, you've heard Prime Minister Modi, everybody's reaction is self-reliance. Let's go home, deal with our economy. And there is some truth in that, because I do think that the US will be more confident getting into something like the TTP and so on, if they're confident of the US economy itself. A lot of the polarization that we see in the US is because of this feeling that people have been left behind by globalization and that large parts of the US didn't benefit from it. And unless that problem is solved, I think, as you said, that trade will be the disruptor, will be a problem. You know, If we had all night, I could sort of go through the issues which I think we can use to incentivize better Chinese behavior. But China responds ultimately to the relative balance of power. That's a historical record. I mean, she behaved very well with the US as long as, until the global financial crisis. And for me, that is the basis. If we don't do that, if we don't establish the right relative balance of power, all the rest of it is fluff, frankly. And that's, I think, a counsel of hope, I still think, not so much of despair, but let's see. It's going to be a hard thing to do.
Counsel of Hope is an interesting quote to take from you, Mr. Menon. Mr. Ignatius, quickly, given the economic situation, the question of how much economic power does the United States really have, and how much is trade going to shape the way the world, trade and economics going to shape the way the world looks at who they want to ally with?
I think Bill Emmett put it very provocatively, in effect saying that trade had swallowed foreign policy for the Trump administration. Trade sometimes seems the only issue. But I just would note it's a very limited and, as Bill said, transactional version of trade relations. I actually hope that trade will be a bigger issue, but not in the trade war, reciprocal tariffs context that Trump made it. For Trump, trade was about getting paid. It was about you aren't doing enough for me. I want more. That was the view of trade discussions, rather than an modern understanding that trade, the flows of trade, benefit both sides and should be encouraged for that reason. So I think American economic power remains overwhelming. If you want to be reminded of that, just think of the financial sphere for a moment. Thank goodness we have in Jay Powell another outstanding Federal Reserve Chairman who saw, as his predecessor Ben Bernanke had seen, that this crash required an absolute firm commitment to make available liquidity, make available funds to keep the markets flowing, keep trades continuing around the world as the absolute essential. He did it. He created new instruments to make it possible. The rest of the world followed quickly. Jay Powell leads most of the key international monetary groups that operate out of Basel. The world is grateful for it. So I think anytime anyone's tempted to say, oh my gosh, we're in the era of declining American power, hold on, just look at the financial sector and how we all gratefully have cued off of the behavior of the Federal Reserve. I'm talking to Christine Lagarde at the ECB. She'd be one of Jay Powell's strongest supporters, I think, which is one more sign of what I said.
Thank you. Interesting. The numbers probably speak. May I get Mr. Levitt in for the conversation? Mr. Levitt, your observation question to the panelists.
Yes, thank you. Let me add here a perspective for Western Asia for a second. I detect in the two presentations, but particularly in the great remarks by David, a sense of yearning for the US that is more sensible in style, coherent in policy, vigorous in its resources, and somber in its assessment of China's peaceful rise. I think that asks for a lot, but let's assume that the US does get a measure of that after the election. So let me ask you then, if this is right, let me take you through the various issues this poses in general for Asia policy of the United States and specifically with respect to China. Will we see the United States reinvested in a massive arms race, including in space to counter Chinese military buildup? Will we see a massive American reinvigoration of the extended deterrence structure with all that this entails? Will we see the US recommitted, as you seem to have implied, to a new or reinvigorated alliance structure in Asia? Disillusioned about a digital economy that does involve China as a major player, and for that matter also Russia, but still cooperative on the environment and eclectic on human rights. I think that the ultimately, in my judgment, the real questions would be how does one balance all of this against a humbled United States that is more inward looking, at least in my judgment, as in terms of what we can expect after the elections. Thank you.
Mr. Ignatius?
Well, Eli has got me right and has well summarized the way I look at these issues. Just to make a few comments of my own, one thing I'm struck by in this period of disrupted American foreign policy, and to some extent a continuing American retreat from the Middle East that began under Obama, is how quickly other countries seem to want to fill some of that space. And China is one of those countries. The Chinese relationship with the United Arab Emirates, with Saudi Arabia, is significant. And I think the Chinese very much want to tell Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, we're there for you, brothers. We're there to, these Americans are always hectoring you about human rights and this and that. We're not, that's not how we play the game. There are reports of Chinese assistance to Saudi Arabia in the nuclear area. I just don't know. I have no independent reporting on that, but it's a sign of the times that that's an issue that would be raised. A second point that I'd underline is what Eli rightly described as deterrence issues. A danger in this world where trust in America as a guarantor of security is diminished is that other countries, even if they don't want to, begin to feel they need to seek their own deterrent capability. So you think, what's Germany going to do? If Germany doesn't trust in America, that goes out of its way to dismiss German interests, where does it turn for the nuclear umbrella? Does it turn to France, its neighbor? That's the only answer I've seen to have gotten. Does it stick with a NATO that's increasingly less reliable? The same question obviously applies to Japan as North Korea becomes a de facto nuclear state. What does Japan do about that? Well, the traditional answer is it depends on the United States and American deterrence and assurance. Is that credible? Will Japan feel going forward that that's credible? So, Eli, I think those are, you're absolutely right to focus on those issues. I don't know the answers yet. I think if you were going to pick a basket of the really hard things for the next administration, those two issues would be right at the top.
Would it possibly be the toughest new president, whoever, I mean, even if it's the return of the president, would it be the toughest you would believe that a job in front of anyone taking office in the US as they come to power after the elections?
I'll say a word, and then I'd love to know what Shankar and Bill and Eli think. Maintaining America's global network of power has been increasingly difficult for 20 years, and each new president has to think carefully about what on the list are the things that I really need to do for American security and the security of our allies. We do some things that just cost a lot and don't produce much. So I think the tough part of this is the strategic decisions that then drive budget decisions. In other words, the national security process. The one thing that's missing with Trump, it's a clear national security process where an NSC frames the choices and then drives decisions. We haven't really had that since Obama.
Right. Let me also.
That leads us back to your mention of Brent Scowcroft. He really set the gold standard for all national security councils, and the way he went about laying down the process was just remarkable. Of the NSA as an honest broker among the principals, and of actually reflecting real policy choices which had been thought through. I mean, it was amazing what he did. I know because, we have a relatively young National Security Council. And I know we looked at that example repeatedly and kept going back to it. We were really struck by that. But I do want to say one thing here in answer to what Eli said. If you do a straightforward comparison of the US and China, I mean, China is an economic superpower, global power, economically. But in every other respect, she is actually working to imitate the US. I mean, you look at Chinese PLA reforms and what Xi Jinping announced in 2015, and what are they doing? They're trying to make their armed forces look like the US armed forces. They're building aircraft carriers, theater commands, they're trying jointness, they're doing all the things, and they look more and more like what the US used to be, what the US is now moving away from and going ahead. They're doing other things as well. I mean, they're looking for asymmetric means to overcome their inferiority. And you finances, of course, yes, but even economically, I mean, and why does China spend so much time and effort trying to split US allies from the US, trying to show them that the US cannot solve your problems? A lot of what she does in South China Sea is meant to show people that, look, don't count on the US, come and talk to us. Because she knows the allies are a strength for the US. So I cannot believe that the Chinese are not clever enough someday to realize that what they are doing in terms of warrior diplomacy is actually hurting them and helping others. I don't think they will ever go back. There is any going back to the previous situation, because I think the Chinese are convinced after the last decade or so that the world is out to prevent their rise and that the US is leading this effort. And now, of course, is explicitly, under the Trump administration, is explicitly supporting regime change in China. So I don't think that suspicion, you know, Shamir used to say, even paranoids have real enemies. You remember? And I think we're now in that situation where I don't think we can ever go back to the earlier days. But I do think we can work with what we have. I do think there's enough here for us to work with to keep the peace.
What you're saying sort of is reference to, the book Inheritance. In his book, The Inheritance, David E. Sanger speaks about the puncher strategy from the Chinese point of view. Maybe it's continuing even now. We also have a journalist with us, another journalist with us, Ananta Krishnan from The Hindu, who joins us as well, who has a question. Go ahead, Ananta.
Thank you both for your remarks today. I learned a lot from both of you, and thank you, Veera, for giving me the chance to pose a question. I was hoping you both could weigh on this in terms of what you think would be some specific areas where it comes to America's China policy where a potential Biden administration may actually continue with some of what Trump has been doing, and what do you think may be a couple of areas where you would most certainly expect a divergence? You did mention trade as one possible area. And if you could both also weigh in on today's announcement on Kamala Harris, which I think you can imagine has made a lot of news where I am, which is Chennai, where her family has roots. And what do you think, what impact would this have, if any, in terms of framing a Biden administration's foreign policy towards Asia? I'd love to hear your thoughts on both those. Thank you so much.
David.
Let me, they're terrific questions. What would be areas of change, innovation for a Biden administration? I think, as I said earlier, the theme for me is more the areas of continuity. I think there is forming a new, forgive this way of putting it, elite foreign policy consensus in the United States about the need for a somewhat firmer stance toward China. And I think that extends broadly across Democrats and Republicans who think about foreign policy. So I think that there would be some continuity in the idea that we should be careful about limiting easy Chinese access to our technology. It's conceivable that there'd be a decision to maintain the entity list designation for Huawei. But Huawei's dominance of 5G infrastructure build out in Europe and around the world is not in America's interest, and it is in our interest to encourage alternative competitors. Interestingly, the most exciting new technologies, as The Economist, Bill Emmons publication tells us are ones being developed in Japan and the US, so-called open radio access networks. So I think that's an area where you'd see some continuity and I think in terms of other technology issues, the Chinese have announced their desire. She's statement about China's role in the world is dependent on Chinese dominance of the heights of technology, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, the driver technologies of the future. So I hope that a Biden administration would give a more coherent focus to what the Trump administration talks about, but hasn't really done much about, which is to focus the U.S. better in those areas. I think Biden is going to want to have subtler means of communication with China. We haven't talked about Russia, but I think Russia is another area where you'll open up, perhaps not initially visibly, but some kind of dialogue to see what's possible. I'd expect that would be the case also with China.
Mr. Menon, any thoughts on this?
Frankly, I don't have anything to add to that, except maybe, because I learned a long time ago that never believe that people will do in office what they promise to do during their campaigns. That's normally a safe principle in most democracies. But I do think that what the Biden administration would represent is a more open US foreign policy with much more dialogue. Also a return to some of the traditional values, democracy, human rights, and so on. And fundamentally to more multilateralism, I think, to working with partners, yes, but also using what we have in terms of institutions. But ultimately, I do think, as David said, that there is a core consensus which has formed in the furnace of the last few years, which is really and that is a much harder view of the world, of China's rise, and promises actually a fair amount of continuity with what this administration, but also the Obama administration was trying to do in its last few years.
Right, thank you so much. I just want to get Bill Emmott in for a few final thoughts as well. Bill, do you believe that we are at a situation where we can see or predict a road ahead with clarity, or is it one that's going to be dependent on many, many factors over the next 6 to 8 months?
Oh, well, I don't unfortunately think that the road ahead is at all clear, mainly because we're 6 months into a pandemic which is throwing up in the air all sorts of assumptions about power, about economic strength, about public policy priorities and others, such that the biggest single thing that a new administration will have to deal with is the economic, social and sort of institutional recovery from the pandemic. In that arena, it will be very hard to see foreign policy, whether towards China or anyone else, really taking a big role. During the campaign, yes, it's more convenient to talk about foreigners in this situation, and particularly foreign threats, than it may be to talk about difficult domestic issues. But the reality in the US is that the domestic issues are going to be the important ones. I would just finally add that I do think that Shankar Menon has got it absolutely right when he emphasizes the way China actually seeks to imitate the United States, which includes in its strategic goal. I think that people talk about China wanting hegemony. I think, well, maybe theoretically they might like it in a century's time, but what they really want to do is to be like the United States and to have equivalent role in the world to that of the United States, equivalent rights to that of the United States, equivalent degree of exceptionalism to that of the United States. I think the biggest goal that non-Americans like myself and others should have is to make sure that the United States is still there and like it is now and has been for the last half century, so that there are two of them. And the important balance for the world is that there should be two such superpowers. maybe they might trample us in the grass, and we rely on India as well to become a superpower too, of course. But it's a flattering thing for the United States, but don't think it's about hegemony. It's about equality.
Interesting. May I just make one observation from my side? I thought the conversation was about US foreign policy in Asia, but think about the amount of time that one devotes to China in this whole aspect, which is perhaps the success of that puncture strategy of the Chinese. I want to invite Toby Simon, the man who makes conversations between borders possible, of the Synergia Foundation, to weigh in with his thoughts. Toby.
I had promised David that we will stop at 6:30, given 2 or 3 minutes extra, so we already crossed the time. I will just conclude by saying, thanking David, Mr. Menon, Bill Emmett, and Ariel for taking the time, and also for the dear colleague from the Hindu. Thank you so much, and have a lovely evening.
Well, thank you so much, Toby. May I just conclude by saying we're continuing to play Chinese checkers on an American football field. Well, thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. An absolute privilege talking to Mr. Ignatius, Mr. Menon, Mr. Levitt, and Mr. Emmott, and of course, Ananthakrishnan from the Hindu. Thank you all for joining in on this broadcast, to all our viewers who joined in on our website to watch this forum.